monitor what's happening at the local level. But we also have quite a large qualitative research component to it, which so where we have 23 sites across those 10 countries, and within each of those 23 sites we have household surveys, we have key informant interviews, as well as focus group discussions. And so we're looking mainly at the sort of neglected social dimensions of the impact of food price volatility, but I'll tell you a bit more about that. The overall research question, so we're looking at well-being, coping, social protection, and every year we have a special topic. So here, one of the questions is how does food price volatility affect the well-being of people on low and precarious incomes? We also look at how these people cope with change. So change particularly in relation to food prices, but of course food prices are also related to other things. We're looking at the sources of formal as well as informal support that are available to people. And every year we have a special topic. So the first year we focused on young people and their perceptions of farming. So is farming something that is appealing to young people, yes or no? And everything in between. And last year we looked at local accountability for food security, because more and more people are talking about the right to food. So we wanted to see, what does it mean? Like, what does it mean to people? What does it mean to me? I don't even really know what a right to food really means. So we're looking at those local perceptions around food security and local accountability. And this year we've decided the third round of research. The special topic is around changing food habits. So the growing importance of processed foods and fast foods, and why do people choose to eat out, and all these things. So as you can tell from these questions, we didn't seek out responses around masculinity or around gender specifically. So in all of the three activities I told you about, so the household, key informant, and focus groups, we have, so there's sort of semi-open interviews. And we ask loads of questions about loads of things, and the same questions are asked every year in addition to the special topic. And none of them are specifically related to gender, apart from asking who does the care work and how does that work out, obviously fitting to different contexts. So where we're working in these 10 different countries. I'm happy to talk about the choice of sites later. But the important thing is that in each site we have a rural, in each country we have a rural site and an urban site. And sometimes there's a third site, so peri-urban or peri-rural. So the context, so why did we choose to do this study? So for a long time, food prices were relatively low and relatively stable. And then with the triple crisis of financial, fuel, and food crisis, as you can tell from this graph, food prices have just sort of gone up, but also all over the place. So that's why we're talking about food price volatility. So obviously there are sort of general impacts, so things like unemployment, insecurity, climate change that also add to this. So there are the obvious impacts on wages and incomes and obviously prices themselves. Differentiated impacts, so the difference between net buyers and net sellers, and of course now I'm going to tell you more about the differentiated impact in terms of gender. But so in the obvious things, obviously you can think about nutrition. So we have a lot of photo activities as well, looking at, so what were you able to buy with this money last year? What are you buying this year? What does your food basket look like? And things like that. But then there are also the hidden and the non-obvious impacts. So satisfaction or pleasure. So people saying, now we eat to survive, and things like this are really important that don't necessarily always come to the fore. The ability to participate in social events, so people not being able to go to weddings anymore because weddings require money to even, attend. And for instance, just like to show you some of these things that we might not always think about, especially at the policy level, for instance, is in Ethiopia we found out that there is a culture around coffee. So I make coffee with my doors open, my windows open, and you walk past it and you smell coffee, so you walk in, you have a cup of coffee with me, and then you carry on. And that was a big thing, part of the culture, but part of the wider social networks. And now with the rise in the price of coffee, people aren't able to have it every day, not even every week, not even every month. So people close their windows, close their doors when they do it. So we have loads of quotes around that. And that's the kind of stuff that we might not always be aware of. So now I'm going to talk about the more gendered findings. So I'm going to focus on women's paid work for now. So the obvious thing that sort of happened across all research sites is the fact that there is more pressure to contribute to household income. So in some sites, that means the women that didn't used to work are now joining the labor force. And the women that already were working often are having to work more hours in often low-paid or very competitive sectors, informal sectors. So markets are now really crowded with loads of women selling loads of small things, small amounts of food. We also had some focus groups in Kenya, for instance. There's a quote there with women that might not see themselves as sex workers, but who engage in sexual activities for food. So having to work longer hours and all the things I've just talked about also means that there's a squeeze on time and effort. So a lot of additional hard work, traveling further, being absent from home, and all the impacts that might have. Migration, which I think one of my colleagues is going to talk about later, that is also a very gendered thing. So people leaving their country, sometimes internal migration, sometimes international migration. And unpaid care work has been one of the things that's really, really come out. And maybe for a lot of you that's just not surprising, because what we've seen is that food price volatility means that women have to shop around, go to a market that is a bit further because it is a little bit cheaper, shop more frequently, so you buy smaller quantities, grow more of your own food, gather wild foods and fuel, be more creative. So you have to provide a meal that is nutritious enough and tasty enough on a lesser income. And in Kenya, when I was visiting the research team last year, I found out that there is a word actually that only applies to women, and it's kujipanga, and it means to be organized. It means to sort of work it out. It's difficult to translate, but it's the idea that as a woman, you have to work it out. You have to work longer, but you still have to do this, and that. And we have loads of quotes from women just talking about the general responsibility and the burden. And this a woman in Zambia saying the burden always falls on the woman. It's the nature of our role as women. And we have quotes from women saying, starting with I'm a machine. I have to wake up at 4 and I do this and then I do that and then I do this, and it just goes on and on and on, and no time to socialize and all these things. And of course there are different impacts as well for, I call them non-normative women, maybe that's not the right term, but for instance single mothers or widows or elderly women for whom it's it's a whole other kind of struggle as well. But now I'm going to focus a little bit on what we found in terms of men. And as I said, I think one of the most interesting things about these findings is that we weren't looking for that. It just emerged. So we saw that everywhere there was a sort of underlying assumption that the men have to be providers, and that's something that's taken for granted, but is very rarely articulated in that way. So it's the pressure of being a breadwinner and having to provide for the family. So we have loads of stories around shame. So an old man in Bangladesh, for instance, telling the story that now he can't afford to buy nice saris for his wife, so she has to wear another type of clothing, and it means that she doesn't want to go to weddings anymore. She doesn't want to interact with her friends or neighbors anymore because she feels she's in shame for not wearing the proper clothes. And this man was telling that story, and you could the whole transcript is just so full of sadness. And shame is something that we rarely talk about in this sort of in the development industry, because they're very difficult things to measure, to even talk about. And here I just wrote the definition of changing roles. Who goes to the market? We found out, for instance, in Indonesia, where markets are a very feminized kind of space, but with loads of changes around women's employment, a lot of men now have to go to the market. And this first quote is from a man who was explaining that now that his wife works more than he does, he has to go to the market, but he goes late in the day or at night because he's too embarrassed. He doesn't want other people to see that he is the one doing that. And conversely, in Bangladesh, where markets are often a very male-dominated space, it's a public space where men can also interact and exchange. Now having to haggle or look for lesser, bad quality, the broken eggs and that kind of stuff. A lot of men don't want to do that. They can't go and bargain. So therefore, the wives go to the market, and that has a lot of implications. So that's the kind of stuff that we're trying to look at. And here, for instance, there's a quote from it was a woman in Bolivia talking about the men around her, the men in her life, talking about the fact that they're proud and they have difficulties asking for help because they must think that others will criticize them for doing so. It's a cultural issue. So all of these all of these insecurities and these very, very defined roles, and make it very difficult to deal with crises. So what happens when you can't be the provider? Of course, we also had loads of stories around the use of alcohol, drugs, violence, increase in domestic violence. It's the whole story, and that happens everywhere. It's not just in developing countries. But what happens when the kids cry because they can't be fed, or all this unhappiness in the household? So what happens? And a lot of what we found is that there is just a lot of violence, which is something that a lot of participants have already talked about in the various sessions. How much time have I got? Okay. So we're seeing all these things, and risk-taking. Men taking riskier and riskier jobs. So in Indonesia, people, or in Bangladesh as well, people working in parts of the country they didn't used to work before, in the jungles, for instance. So there is all the risk attached to working in the jungle. So what we've come up with, and we're still working on this, is the idea of poor man's patriarchy. So what we've seen is that for the majority of men, and here I'm talking about men on low and precarious incomes in the communities we've been working with, there are fewer and fewer privileges from being a man in a patriarchal society. But yet the burdens, the responsibilities are still here. You still need to be a provider. So what we're seeing is a sort of washed out version of traditional male privileges in a lot of these sites. And Nancy Fraser has an interesting framework to talk about that, talking about how crises provide like these sort of three-way forces almost. So she sees it as a clash of pro-market and protective and then emancipatory drives. So we can, and by I think I want to draw on this idea of emancipatory. So what do we do with the fact that a lot of men are now sometimes able to see that they're sort of confined to a role that they can no longer play in a way, and maybe this can provide scope for sort of wider coalition to talk about these things, to talk about these gender norms. So I'm just going to wrap up and say that, so in summary, what I've said is that those changes in food prices, they disrupt a lot of patterns of everyday consumption, but also everyday life and the way we relate to each other, and gender roles is such a central element to that. But what I want to say, and I think that's something one of the speakers at the first plenary this morning was talking about crises as, what did he say, economic crisis or normality. So what we're seeing is that now what we from the outside still call a crisis is the new normal. People who have adjusted to some extent, they have their own strategies, but so I think it's all the more important to try and look at the new norms that are emerging in this context. And so some of the questions we want to try and dig deeper into is what do poor men have to gain from patriarchy in this present form, and how can we try to engage men in thinking about these cross-gender, even beyond gender, but these sort of coalitions. So we've got loads of publications. I have some resources here that I'm happy to share. And this is our website page. You can visit it. And if you have any feedback, I look forward to hearing it. Thank you.
Thanks, Alexandra. Poor man's patriarchy, not very different from rich man's patriarchy. But so we'll do 5 minutes of questions, any clarifications or comments you have for Alexandra, and then move on to Thomas. Yes, please. You introduce yourself.
I'm from Sri Lanka. When you this is a food presentation, and when you consider this food intake, did you consider the calorie intake per day? Calorie intake per day in this family.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you consider that?
Let's take 2 questions and then
I wonder if you've looked at change across a time trajectory that's longer than a fairly short term, because you're suggesting that what you're looking at and the impact of change is like a major disjunction from a prior norm. But I just wonder if you've interrogated that as an assumption, because it might not be true, and in fact, you know, poor man's patriarchy now may be the same as poor man's patriarchy 30 years ago, and that has rather different implications.
Regarding the calorie intake, so the different national teams do their work. I mean, sometimes in similar ways, but sometimes in different ways, because it also depends. Sometimes we work with universities, sometimes we work with, for instance, in Bangladesh, BRAC is doing the work, so they also have their own agendas, and sometimes in Vietnam we work with the survey, which is also like a national government thing, so they sometimes add these things. We're not specifically looking at calorie intake, but obviously it's part of the thing. So when I was talking about the food basket, it's something that of course is part of the findings. So yeah, to that extent, yes. About change, yeah, that's a really important aspect, because of course that's what we're trying to look at. That's why it's a longitudinal study, and it's very difficult to see what has changed, what's the framework we're working within, what's the context. And I think, it is an interesting question to see the difference between poor men's patriarchy now and how it was, say, 30 years ago. But I think what we've seen is an exacerbation of maybe existing challenges. Maybe these challenges were already there. But I would say that they have become more visible, more clear. I mean, it's also the way people articulate that. So some people will very clearly say, now because of this, now because of that, because of the change in the price of this particular commodity, I can no longer consume this product. So it depends. Like, it's difficult now to give like a sort of general overview, but we do. I think in some sites it's sometimes clearer than others. I think in the urban sites it's a lot more defined, because the crisis had obviously different impacts in the rural areas and the urban areas. So I'm thinking in, for instance, the urban area in Kenya, in Mukuru, people were very, very clear about what the changes were. So that's also one of the questions, that what has changed. We don't necessarily go in with our assumptions of what has changed, but it's something that comes at the start of the discussion. But yeah, I think it's something we need to consider, and we have been trying to think about clearly how we are dealing with this question of change. Does that make sense?
Yes, I just think that people talk a lot about crisis of masculinity and assume it's a new thing that men can't fulfill a provider role, but in fact provider roles have been there for men since time immemorial, and most men being unable to fulfill it has also been there since time immemorial. So if we want to understand about masculinity, I think it's just the word change. It's not, I don't want to sort of seem unsympathetic towards polite poor men, but I think if we're analysing it with a masculinity change, it's really important to understand what does constitute change and what isn't change, and what actually is a different type of normal, and an inability to meet the provider role is not a new phenomenon in any society.
My name is Maria Eugenia Villarreal. I'm coming from Mexico. And I would like to ask you that we have now different scenarios. We are living different scenarios that have a huge impact in terms of masculinities and roles, etc. For example, migration. Every migration, now the massive migration that we are living today, have had a huge impact in the roles and in terms of masculinity. And then how we now to be updated in terms of the concept that you were talking about, and these new scenarios that we are facing today.
Should we take your question around migration, also link it to the presentation that you focus on it?
Yes.
Maybe
maybe
that will be useful.
Very good.
I mean, we don't have answers to all the questions here, but it's important to flag them. Any more questions?
I just have a question actually linked to the previous question, and you could answer it at any point. Is
how do you know that the changes that you are seeing are because of just food price volatility and nothing else? Because there's so many other factors.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I said at the start, is that things like climate change, for instance, are not, I mean, to some extent it is linked to the financial crisis, was also very much linked to climate. But in some sites there were droughts, and others there were floods, and obviously that's beyond that. Now, obviously, we're limited to this specific study, but I think in this paper we're also trying to go beyond that and look at a wider, like the wider changes that are happening around. So climate change, for instance, being like one of the obvious ones. So yeah, so it's not just that theory.
I have a curious question. Right? Given that it's a 10 country study, an idea of gender justice, why is it that the gender question wasn't on the radar only later on? So is it, that's one. And the other is it, the data itself, is it family or household based, or is it individuals who are responding? And if they are individuals, do you have, male, female, so that can be teased out whether there are perceptions and feelings about whether patriarchy has changed
So for your second question, who are the respondents? So we have household interviews, so we try to have the whole family. It depends on the situation and the context of the interview, but yeah, so household interviews, key informants, and focus groups. So of course the focus groups, we always try to have focus groups with men, focus groups with women, focus groups with young people, sometimes mixed, sometimes not. It depends. Like certain things you can do in some countries and you can't in others. But no, we definitely have a wide range of participants, and we're very, there's definitely a gender balance in our participants. That's obvious. As for gender not being on the radar, maybe I didn't make it clear from the start, but it was very much on the radar. It's just that the questions weren't specifically. It's not that we weren't looking for it, but they're open interviews, and the focus groups are also very, very open. So we knew these things would come out, and we did make sure to have certain, like the questions around care, for instance, which obviously bring out other things. And we also have a section on formal and informal networks, and within that, of course, the family is one of the things. So there are questions around how the family functions and who's in charge of what. So it was very much on the radar, of course.
Thank you. I apologize for this room. We don't have the mic. We are very cramped. I mean, half of them can't see you. You can't see them. But we have to make it work. So thank you, Alexandra. We'll come back to when we open up the sessions. I have a more proper introduction for Thomas. He's a lecturer at Kenyatta University in School of Humanities and Social Sciences. And he's going to give us his presentation on development, gender, and the crisis of masculinity among the Maasai people in Kenya. So from 10 countries we moved to 22.
Thank you very much. My name is Thomas Chibona Kibutu from Kenyatta University, as you said, and I'm presenting presentation is entitled Development, Gender, and the Crisis of Masculinity Among the Maasai People of Kenya. And I start with a quote there by Michael Kimen, one of the presenters yesterday in the morning, that although we understand that development is a gendered process, it's widely understood, the impact of development on men remains relatively less understood. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Our introduction there, when I'm saying that studies on gender and development among the Kenyan Maasai have been more about women. I think, like in most areas in the world, and few studies have been done systematically and explicitly to discuss masculinities. The net effect of this is that men's historical experiences with development in quotes, development, I'm problematizing development because I'm not using development in the common man's understanding of development, as we shall see, has been rendered invisible. Yet, quoting Francis Criver, dominant masculinities and gender relations in general are bound with historical relations of economic and political dominance, particularly with the workings of imperialism and capitalism. I'm also saying that up to the eve of colonialism, that's about slightly more than 100 years ago, or just about the Berlin Conference of 1884-85, the Maasai ethnic group practiced a highly specialized form of nomadic pastoralism. This generated cohesion, togetherness, within the community and marked it symbolically, economically, and socially from other communities, from other ethnic communities in Kenya and the wider East Africa. I argue in this presentation that developmental endeavors have had consequences for their pastoral subsistence strategies and also for gender relations and masculinities in particular. Maasai masculinities at the eve of colonialism. This is a wide area, and I've just summarized. By the way, this work is based on my research that I did at the University of Leicester in the UK as part of my PhD, and I think this is a whole chapter. I'm summarizing a whole chapter, 3 bullets. And I'm saying that age, wealth, and generosity are important aspects of Maasai masculine identities, especially for married men. And not just men, if you allow me to add, age was also an important aspect in as far as power among women was concerned. So that the older a woman, the more power they accumulated. Cattle and wives, I'm quoting Mark 1910 there. For a man, a large herd of cattle and many wives, they were polygamous, are his greatest delight. That observation was made in 1910. He who had both enjoyed esteem and respect. What he's saying here is that polygamy and the ability to provide. Polygamy went to the ability to provide. One could not have married many wives without the ability to provide for the wives and the children. And this provision came from the nomadic pastoralists. It came from the ability to accumulate more heads of cattle. For warriors, the younger men, sharing and solidarity, they were trained after circumcision, and displays of martial prowess. Some of you who probably have gone to Kenya, the Maasai culture, and especially the Maasai Moran, the Maasai warrior, has been used extensively in branding hotels, in branding tour companies, in branding national parks, and so on. Prowess. Enhance individual and age-set reputations. So what he's saying here is that the warriorhood masculinity was highly respected among the young people. The making of British colonial masculinity. So why am I going to British colonial masculinities? Many studies have ignored the fact that colonial masculinities were actually deliberately nurtured. They did not just happen. They were deliberately nurtured. And we're talking about hegemonic masculinities being deliberately nurtured and deployed in the colonies to go and subjugate other masculinities. That's why I've endeavored to go into this. They're saying, quoting here and there, colonialism has often been seen as a masculine project consisting of white men subjugating and civilizing natives, also men. The soldier hero narrative and the public school culture were most instrumental, especially in Britain, but also in other European countries. Once the empire was established, I'm quoting Cornell, most of us have read Cornell, he's one of the greatest authors of books on masculinities. So he's saying here that once the empire was established, the public schools maintained it. it generated the imperial enthusiasm. The ancient universities completed the process. That's according to Bruce Berman, a historian. Ancient here experimented mainly University of London, Cambridge, and Oxford. Sons of the bourgeois and professional middle class indoctrinated in the dominant class ideology. So it's not just every other boy in the country. There were specific boys from certain classes in the society. And what was emphasized? Military virtues such as aggression, strength, courage, and endurance were the inherent qualities of manhood, as was emphasized. Impacts of, oh sorry, that is development. It's supposed to be development. And again, I'm looking, there's a minute below, I'm sorry about that. So what are the impacts of development in general? I want to say that I'm giving a very broad overview, like I've said. So what are the impacts, both during the colonial and neo-colonial rule? Colonial rule and subsequent post-colonial development endeavors were characterized by imbalances of power grounded on the civilizing mission. The first thing that happened when the British went to Kenya was the military conquest of the natives, so-called natives. And it was actually rationalized. This is the concept of pacification. The warring African tribes had to be pacified. And that way many Africans lost their lives, they lost their properties. And later on, as you're going to see, they lost their land. Land alienation. Among the Maasai, the alienation of land was actually probably one of the greatest things. Between 1904 and 1911, the Maasai lost most of their dry season pasture lands to British colonial settlers. And this had big implications. And it was rationalized that the Maasai were irrational users of their land. The myth of empty land in Africa was also emphasized. And of course, this camouflaged their real intentions to exploit the resources through appropriation. Later on, wildlife, the discourse of wildlife conservation. If you go to Kenya, most of the game parks and wildlife reserves are found within the former Maasai land. And again, the myth of empty land. This way, we are saying that the Maasai lost a lot of their land. Then later on, towards the end of British colonial rule and after independence, there was a move. Initially, land among the Maasai was owned communally. Then there was insistence by the Kenya government, by the World Bank and other Western institutions that communal ownership of land was wasteful. The tragedy of the commons, those who have heard about it. And the Maasai were encouraged to have their land privatized. And today, much of the Maasai land is actually private land. Culture and identity were also impacted upon. Persistent efforts were made to curb the social institutions that were vital to Maasai identity and culture. This was done through devaluing, the othering of such institutions. Those who have read Said and Orientalism know what I mean by othering. For example, the Maasai Manyata system, a vital institution of transmitting culture, was completely interfered with. There was the issue of alcohol. In my research, I found that there were politics of colonialism in the issue of alcohol. The Maasai used to have their own indigenous alcohol. And when the British came, they said, no, this is primitive, it's harmful to your health, we are going to show you the best beer. What is referred to as the European bottled beer. Manufactured, but more importantly, manufactured for sale, whose manufacture and sale were dominated by Western interests. The East African breweries, the main manufacturer of beer today in Kenya, is one of the biggest private company in Kenya, and one of the most profitable. Yeah, that's the background. Livestock, there were control. I can't cover everything, but I'm just mentioning it. There was controlled breeding of Maasai stock, which was meant actually to do what? To disadvantage them in terms of competition as they were farmers. What are some of the gendered effects in general? Conquest, the initial conquest. During the first decade, we have said the Maasai were militarily defeated. There was a war, like many parts of Africa and like many parts of the formerly colonized areas of the world. And the Maasai Morans, the Maasai warriors were defeated mainly because of the superiority of the British arms. I'm saying, I'm arguing here, and I'm arguing in my former that this had a masculinizing effect on the Maasai, especially the warriors. One of the expressions of their manhood was warriorship, the ability to defend the community from enemies, whether they are human beings or they are wildlife. Lots of livelihoods. The alienation of Maasai land led to a lot of issues. I mentioned that they were pushed to the driest areas of Maasai land. Where they live today is the driest area. The higher, well-watered areas were taken away. Livelihoods were lost. Families could not have the same number of animals that they used to have before. There were no grasses. There were no pastures. Then we are talking about neoliberal policies of NAD. The Maasai over the years have been encouraged to sell their land, to privatize their land. What has happened? Especially near Nairobi, the capital city. Maasai land, actually Nairobi, where Nairobi is, used to be part of Maasai land. They have been encouraged to have title deeds, to own privately. And what has happened is that speculators have gone there over the years, bought that land, quite expensive on the average. So a young man will inherit some land from the father, and they are told, look here, you can get 1 million shillings from this small piece of land. What has happened? This morning we had a presentation where somebody was talking about the little knowledge of the market. Most of this money has been wasted. Families, including wives and children, have been left destitute by this young man. Migration. What has happened is that with the restricted areas of pasture, the Maasai have had to move longer distances, even outside Maasai land, in search of pastures and water. What has this meant? It has meant a number of things. One of them is that these men and boys would migrate. It has meant family breakups. Men would move for weeks, for months, sometimes even for years. It has led to family breakups as part of the crisis I'm talking about. Because of the distances with their spouses, HIV, that's part of my findings in my research, has been on the increase. Boy-child dropout rates in schools has also been observed. Of course, there's the issue of climate change, but there's no question about whether the impact of alienation of Maasai land contributed. That's there. Alcohol, what time please? 2 more minutes. Alcohol again. What are the impacts of the new mode of alcohol, the bottled beer? The impact there's several impacts. Among the Maasai, the traditional beer had rules and regulations. For example, for a man to start taking beer, it's not just every other man. First of all, they had to reach a certain age. They had to be married, and they had to actually get permission. Remember, there are no commercial alcoholic drinks then. What has happened today? There are no controls. So long as you have money, you can get into a pub and drink. This has had implications: violence in home, health among these young men, and so on and so forth. What are some of the reflections, finally? I'm just saying, could we think about the need to recognize the larger forces, regional and global, that impact on masculinities? And how do these forces feed on gender inequalities? What is the role of us here as gender activists? Balancing social welfare issues with programming. Could we be treating the symptoms? I think in today and yesterday, these things have come up. But it's good to target behavior and attitude change. But is that good enough? Because there are forces out there. This morning there were issues of globalization. Forces out there that are impacting, they are feeding into these gender inequality issues. Where do we come? Is there a need for broadening alliances other than men engaged, probably dealing with boys and men, behavioral change? Are there wider issues of social justice that needs to be addressed? Thank you very much. A few references there.
rest to the question.
Okay.
Because
If I may
most
have.
people will not be able to see you. So.
Oh yeah. Thank you very much. You're welcome.
Any questions, clarifications, comments?
Yes, please.
Yeah, from our own study in North Karnataka, where there are similar situations in terms of work conditions and loss of livelihood. How does the powerlessness that men feel? How does it translate to what happens in relationships? Their relationship with the woman in the family, and what happens in the family? Did you come across that in any of your observations among Maasai?
Oh yeah, I've just mentioned. Thank you. I've just mentioned that one. If you look at the issue of land, there's been a lot of sale of land. There are so many Maasai families that are today destitute. In fact, if you go to the city of Nairobi, majority of the watchmen, the guards, security guards are Maasai. Many of them have were either displaced during those days of alienation, but most of them have been displaced by the by the neoliberal policies of privatization of land. This has had far-reaching consequences to families. When they sell their land, what happens to the children? What happens to the family in general? They are rendered destitute. When it comes to the issue of alcohol, abuse of alcohol with no control, as it were during those days, has led to violence. It has led to loss of violence among within the domestic spaces, among others.
Thinking more about the relationship dynamics
Within families.
I think what I'm alluding to, for example, in terms of the sale of land, because that's a very serious issue.
Because if it's
The issue
manipulation and they're not staying together.
They're not staying together. Often when a man sells the land, they disappear into town, and because of the shame, they don't want to come back to town. So the relationship broken, basically speaking. And then migrations also break families. There are reports of men staying out there, marrying, taking up other wives. And the women who are left, especially those who are near urban areas, because of destitution, they would go into prostitution. And this has implications to HIV and breakdown of families.
Alcohol makes injustice both men and women. In my country context, that if I am a boy, there is a social pressure to use alcohol.
Yeah.
If I am ignore that, if I am refuse that I have to face lot of social pressure, as well as young males. They have to face another kind of injustice. That is, they are the victims who their boyfriends or husbands are using alcohol.
Yeah.
So both sides the injustice is from alcohol. You are very correct in mention that alcohol as a main issue as this one.
Yeah, it has both impacts to men and women. And I think there's also that other question now, of men as perpetrators, men as victims. Where is the urgency? This is another thing, which you need to reflect on. Why is the urgency? Where do you draw the borderline?
Two questions. In your study and research of Maasai communities, have you looked at what was the status of sort of gender equality before colonization? So what are sort of some of the fault lines and relationships before colonization itself? Because, clearly this issue is not all post-colonial, and some of this is deeply rooted in just gender injustice or imbalance that has existed in traditional society. So what is your thought about that? And second, as some of the men in the communities have moved away, have women then been able to take on roles of traditional leadership and transformation that were not available to them before? So I think just since I know nothing about the context in which this study is being conducted, it'd be useful to know whether you saw any of those.
Thank you very much. Yes, one of my chapters actually, I look at gender relations among the Maasai at the eve of colonial rule. And there are issues, of course. But one of the things that has been ignored in the analysis of gender relations during the pre-colonial times is that it was not so much man-woman, but age was a very important denominator. Both men and women, as I said, accumulated more power as they grew up. For example, in polygamous family, the first wife had a lot of power, not only over their children, but also over the younger wives and the younger men in the family other than the husband. But it was characterized by a very strict division of labor among men and women. Men and boys would mainly take care of livestock. They would also play the role of protectors. Women did most of the nurturing, taking care of the family, cooking, fetching water, and so on and so forth. The stereotypical. Then there was also the issue of gender-based violence. It was slightly different from what it is today. Women, when they got men, when they got circumcised, they got into age groups. And they went, it's like a cohort. They would belong to that age group until they died. It was taken, there was a lot of solidarity within the age group. And one of the things that was highly discouraged is wife beating. And if you beat your wife for no good reason, so to say, if there are good reasons, that's what came from the study. You would be punished by your age group. There were some checks. There were some checks and balances. But we are not saying that there was no gender-based violence. It was there. But your second question, yes. One of the things that I found out is that in some instances, actually women are gaining more economic power. The women who are left. They went into beadwork. Those who have seen those, do I have? Oh yeah, I have a belt here. If you allow me, I'll show you. It will come down. This is what I was given. No, it will come down. This is it. This one I was given. My research assistant was a Maasai. The mother to the young man who gave me this. They went into this. This is normally sold to tourists. And very high demand. So what happened is that on average, it was there is that women were making more money than men who went out there. In any case, when they went out there, most of the livestock would die either from drought or from diseases. Women were becoming more financially emancipated. That's one of the things that I noticed. But of course, we must also recognize that women, there's also classes among women. Yes, we have women who have power, women who do not have power. Those who do not have means of getting, for example, the ingredients of making this, will not do that. But in general, there was that. Yes. Yes.
Just one link to each question.
Yes.
Just in terms of polygamy, so I work in Burundi,
yeah.
one in DRC, and then also Sudan. Just in terms of the connection between the cattle and the wives.
Yeah.
And whether you ask any, whether you can say whether it's similar. One of the justifications for women to agree to polygamous relationship, marriages are because they'll lessen burden. They will have more, so she will work as hard as much as she can to make sure the husband gets rich enough, so he can buy more cattle. That means he can get married to another woman. That means her burden is less in terms of household work. So do you see any difference? This is what I've been told, throughout that region. So I don't know. I'm not researched in Kenya. Just whether it's seen that even now is polygamy. I've seen a lot of advocacy for legalizing polygamy in Kenya. Whether that you see the link in this shifting of roles, how is that being sustained? They're saying women are having more economic power, and how does that kind of connect now, since you're saying women have lost the problem, etc. So
you see, the institution of polygamy is over the years has gone down in a big way. One is that quite a number of them became Christians. Christianity does not allow polygamy. If you legally marry, previously, if you legally marry in a government office, even today in Kenya, if you marry a second wife, that's bigamy. So things have changed. But by and large, to answer your question, there are two issues here. One of them is that most of those marriages were pre-arranged. Yeah, the girl did not have a lot of say. They were sold off, if you like. So their agency here was. But I would want to think, of course, the fathers would sell off their daughters. Would not marry off their daughters. would not marry off their daughters to a poor man, because there was that dowry to be paid. They were looking forward for the many heads of cattle to come to their home. I don't know how, because and they were married off when they were young. So I don't know whether they had many choices. But if we can broaden it, we would probably say in many other societies, where probably polygamous societies, a man with more wealth would definitely have more wives. So by implication then, without saying that they were attracted to, but there are so many other forces, religious forces, government forces that have impacted on the institution of marriage to the extent that looking at the empowerment of women versus whether they are now getting to
I think we'll just close this now.
Okay.
And thank you so much.
You're most welcome.
Next we have Piotr, a PhD candidate from Institute of Human Rights and Peace Studies, going to talk about poverty and migrations as drivers of change, experiences from Bangladesh.
So good afternoon. My name is Peter Pavlak, and I am from Mahidol University in Bangkok, Thailand, and I'm presenting on behalf of two of my distinguished colleagues, actually lead researchers for this project, Dr. Mahin Sultan and Bayazid Hassan from the Center for Gender and Social Transformation, BRAC Institute of Governance and Development in Dhaka, Bangladesh. This is a very small research project that is part of a larger study commissioned and financed by the World Bank under their gender activities in South Asia. And it has been undertaken as a part of the larger paper that is coming up entitled Masculinities, Gender and Development in South Asia. The research, that particular research examined how in the context of urban poverty in Bangladesh, migration and women's increased economic opportunities and activities create a scope of redefining of some of the rigid conceptions of masculinities in Bangladesh and allow for some of the gender roles and gender norms to be redefined, reshaped, or perhaps challenged. There was also several other secondary questions, but for the purpose of this panel and because of the time consideration, I'll be focusing only on the findings that we see coming out from the interviews with men, but also those findings that relate specifically to household or the vision of household responsibilities and child care. So the methodology of the study is based on a primary research in 3 locations in rural areas, in actually rural Dhaka, and 1 peri-urban setting in Dhaka. So we have 2 slums and one peri-urban area. We conducted about 35 interviews, 24 in-depth interviews with men in 2 age categories, 16-35 and 36-55, as well as 11 in-depth interviews with women who are somewhat related to those men. They were wives, daughters, sisters, and so on. We also had the chance to speak with some of the government officials as well as with organizations, NGOs and CBOs based in those sites. So in order to paint a better picture for you and for us as a researcher to understand the potential relation between migration and changes in gender roles, I would like to give you a quick update on the trends in migration in Bangladesh. So the trends are suggested by the recent study conducted by the Bureau of Manpower, Employment and Training, and its 2011 study in Bangladesh. And what we see is that almost 13% of all households in Bangladesh report some kind of immigration, either internal or international, with over 80% of migrants being from rural areas and majority of them being men. In fact, 97% of all migrants are men. So the overall trend is also that more men migrate internationally, while more women migrate internally. In terms of gender perspective in those trends, we see that the migration for men started in the mid-70s and continues until late 80s, when there was a huge breakthrough, and the numbers of men migrants rose from thousands to almost hundreds of thousands, and continues so until 2006. And in 2007, 2008, there was yet another breakthrough in which the number rose to almost 900,000 migrant men. For females migrants, the migration actually started in the in the 90s at around 1.5% of all migrants, but kept decreasing until 2003, and then in 2004 jumped from 1% to 4%, and today's estimates that it's about 15% of total migrants are females. So in order for us to understand whether migration, internal or international, along with women's increased economic activities, was having actually any effect on gender equitable practices, such as sharing of household responsibilities, contributing to the child work, we had to first explore what are the concepts of masculinities that are already existing on the ground. And so we interviewed our male but also female respondents and found that men's perceptions, as in many other sites in Bangladesh, South Asia, and perhaps globally, are not so different, and they consider themselves men. They see themselves as masculine when they are breadwinners, providers, when they earn money and provide for the family, when they are not challenged and are kind of on the top, so they have a final decision in the household. To be a man, for those men interviewed in the study, meant also to be married and be responsible for wife or for children. We also asked women quite similar question about their perceptions of the ideal husband of a masculine man, and the response was that once again it's the one who is responsible, who earns, who provides money, but also the one who doesn't gamble and takes drugs. Interestingly, women also express a need for men to be dominant, even if their educational level was higher or their income was higher than men's. So looking at those two, the patterns in migration, but also the existing perceptions of what it means to be men, we assumed that perhaps migration will be a driving force for changes, potential driving factor for change in both the gender roles, but also conceptions of some of those rigid masculinities. And in order for us to understand how we explored how that happens, we explored the reason and patterns in decision making for migration. And what we found that reasons for migrating to Dhaka were quite similar among all respondents, mainly poverty, indebtedness, economic pressure. Most of the interviewees actually mentioned that it's quite easy for females to acquire a job in garment factories, to be housemates, to be home-based worker. And also for men, it was quite easy to acquire some kind of a job, mostly as a laborer or rickshaw puller. Many have already, in terms of rural to urban migration, many have already some acquaintances, family members, sisters, or relatives working in Dhaka. In terms of international migration, what we've seen, especially from one of the sites, Doher, that the geographic location was quite influential. So the history of previous migration of friends, colleagues, family members, also neighbors, was significant motivational aspect for migration. We also observed that specifically for women, the decision to migrate internationally was initiated by the need to repay family debts, to secure savings and improve family situation in the long run in the future. We also observe certain patterns in decision making to migrate. And in terms of rural-urban, both men and women would make decision and then consult us with husband or wife. And in terms of international, that was quite similar, although women will say that they made decision themselves, but then when we asked the same question men, they would say, well, yes, she made the decision, but I was the driving force. So there was almost a need to be owner of the decision among men. So how migration and women's economic engagements influence and change concepts of masculinity along with gender norms, and whether and how this translated into practice, we ask men questions about their attitudes and also about their practices. And so what we find out was that there was increasing acknowledgement from men of the overwhelming number of household activities and chores that the female have to do every day. What we however have seen and heard from men is that they continue not to recognize some of them. And one of the examples was that going to a market, going shopping outside of the home, was not necessarily seen as a household activity because such is not done indoor. Men also believe that household activities is not necessarily their natural role, but more of a practical necessity. So they would do it, they will recognize their value, but only because they have to know. We also look at their practices. We ask about their practices. And in terms of male respondents' opinions, men are valuing and doing some chores related to or activities related to care of children. They playing, interacting with children. They bathing them or cook for them. Childcare is done somewhat willingly, especially if a female is absent because she's participating in an international migration. However, men would assume those responsibility only partially, and often what we have seen is that they will ask mothers, daughters, or female relatives or family members for help, and that would actually be also with the financial incentive that will come from that money earned by female in the international migration. We also have noticed that that many husbands of working women are doing and sharing some of the household responsibilities. However, there are some differences in terms when such sharing occur. And if in terms or in situation with wife was a home-based worker, there was some level of equality, and especially when those men were exposed to previously in childhood to those activities. If wife was abroad of migration, husband and son will do that work. They felt compelled to do it now. And if wife had a full-time employment, and most of the time that employment would be employment in a garment factory, there will be sharing of responsibility equally. And what we have, when we digged a little bit more, we heard that garment factories employment is now being considered almost like an official with relatively better working condition. So perhaps that's one of the aspects to think about in this conversation. However, if both husbands and wife were operating a small business or a shop together, husbands would do nothing, and wife would have to take the full responsibility for the household chores, and also would have to adjust her working hours to match those responsibilities. We also found that that respondents with childhood experiences and exposure to household work were more receptive to do it now. Some male respondents who were equally sharing those responsibilities said that they are doing this willingly because they've seen it in their mothers doing it, they've seen their sister doing this, but also in many occasions they were kind of pushed to do it because there was no other options for them. In conclusions, so what we have observed among rural urban migrants respondents is that poverty, which have led to that migration, has led women to take up on paid employment, and those are different types. As I mentioned, in that particular study group, we've seen garment factories work, housemaid, or some kind of home-based activities. And for men, taking on whatever work is available, rickshaw pullers, laborers, some kind of informal employment. Among the same rural-urban migrant population, we have found that men have taken more on household responsibilities, and women have taken more on what they refer to on a male traditional responsibility, which was earning, asset management, thinking about how to save and how to perhaps invest some of those money. So in conclusion, among international migrants, our assumption from the beginning that international migration, which comes with perhaps exposure to different values, opinions, lifestyle, may actually make men more open, more gender equitable, has been challenged. The relations have not been found among respondents in 2 out of 3 sites that we worked in, and what we have actually observed was that they have actually even more conservative or more constrained views on some of the division of household responsibilities or childcare. We also have found that despite more opportunities and possibly better income for female who are going to international migration than for men, their families and societies are quite reluctant to accept such idea. Often the husband had to persuade themselves that that's something that might be beneficial to the family, but certainly had to talk to the neighbors and community that that's also ultimately in the long run a beneficial factor for the family. So in a very last final word, through this very small research that once again is a part of a larger study, what we were able to point out are a few potential driving forces for change, and perhaps they're not so new for many of us, but perhaps give a little bit more food for thoughts. What we observe is that economic pressure are making the model of double income family more acceptable and more prevalent. Paid work that has defined historically in Bangladesh the notion of masculinity and being a man is now also part of the women's identity, even if a female is the partial supplementer or a partial provider for the family. Urban context and migration contribute to greater sharing of household responsibility in comparison to earlier generations. Families, couples, individuals are able to undertake some of activities that they were not able to do in some of the rural settings that they come from. Greater public visibility and acceptance of women, economic contribution to family is a driving force for change. Greater valuing of their contribution to family results in some level of men's willingness to contribute and to be part of that household activities. And finally, what I mentioned already, the childhood experience of gender equality plays a significant role. Having earning mothers or helping in household during childhood was a contributing factors for those men to have a working wife and sharing household responsibilities. And in the very final words, what we can see through this research, once again, very small scale, that changing conceptions of masculinity and gender norms is a very complex and a very prolonged process. Of course, this is nothing new. And while practices in this and many other settings are changing to allow men and women to accommodate or perhaps adjust to some of their circumstances, norms are much more resistant to change, and we haven't been really able to determine the full scope of that change. Thank you.
Questions, clarifications, comments? Slide 1. So, like you said, economic pressures have been shifting social norms in the urban context. But when these families move back, even for a little while to visit and all, do they slip back into the old roles? Did you talk to them about that?
Yeah, so our research has not looked into that, but we know from other research conducted by Bangladesh recently that actually men who are coming back from a migration, either international or national, they actually would love the situation to be back where they were before. And for women, what it means that they having a very hard time to adjust to this kind of the previous reality.
And was there any difference between the older and the younger group in terms of perception and
So younger generation was much more receptive to that change, but we haven't been really able to look deeper into it. Our sample was quite small.
Yeah. Good question.
Yeah, I just wanted to know, it was very interesting that you shared the contradiction that, having gone to an international migration, often, have was contra to what you had assumed will be the change in the perception of the men. So could you elaborate a little more on what are your findings?
Let's take the second question.
My question is around the double income and shifting of the work provider, whether that was in any ways linked to the escalation of violence within the home. Which is one of the things that from my study in India, in the African region, what I found is like the shifting of how all the cost conflict of identity and the men to be able to, using the space at home to kind of reclaim that identity. Most of the resorting to violence.
Unfortunately, we haven't looked at this. How does it really influence or spark the incidents of violence? So I'm sorry, I can answer this. And I wasn't sure what you were asking.
I wanted you to elaborate on that comment you made about the international migration, and you expected men to have
better gender-equitable attitude, but it was contradictory. And did you probe on that, why that was, or what were the findings?
So we're still analyzing the data and looking into specific findings, so I'll be happy to kind of get back to you on this question. I'm sorry, I just don't have I don't want to speculate on that.
last quick question and then we'll move.
Small, just a clarification. If I understood correctly, the information was that in case of domestic migration, there was basically like a joint decision.
Yes.
In case of international migration, the decision was primarily either by the husband or implicitly by the wife.
So it was the same pattern. Both would make a decision individually and then consult with husband or wife. However, when we interviewed husbands of international migrant females, they would say, "Oh no, we kind of made it together. It's that the idea was born together, and they actually had the final saying that she will be okay to go on migration." So we felt that there was a need for men to have the ownership of the decision, where in fact women will contradict them and say, "No, we made the decision. I decided to go."
In case of those migration instances, did both husband and wife travel together to a destination, or was it, like for example in domestic you say they went to Dhaka and
so in terms of rural urban, it will be mostly couple moving. Either, for example, a female will be going first or a male will going first, and very soon after the female will follow up, the male will follow. In terms of international migration, it will be only one going, and then either returning, or when we interviewed some of them and their spouse was already outside of the country.
Okay, we'll have to close this down.
Sure.
Thank you. Our last presentation for the afternoon, Professor Benedito from Brazil. Yeah, he'll be speaking in Spanish and should we use the tiny room? I don't know.
Hi everybody. Sorry, but I don't speak English very well.
We understood that.
But I have a lot of friends. I would like to include Mary to do this slides in English. I did some changes. If you have problem with me, it's not with her, and I have a translator here. In some case, when we were talking in español, we you can read in English sometimes. My name is Benedito Medrado. I'm a teacher in Brazil, but empecé como trabajando en una ONG feminista con hombres.
I'm a professor in the university, but recently I started working as an activist in the feminist NGO.
Que trabaja con hombres.
Which work with men.
Yeah. Los otros autores también hacen parte de estos dos grupos. Entonces, el núcleo de investigación de género y masculinidad y la ONG que se llama Instituto Papai.
The other researchers also, that the name we see, they also work in this organization. The name of the organization is Papai.
This is a support. Apoyo.
This is a support from.
Yeah.
You have only 10 minutes.
It's because I am from an up country colonized by Portuguese. Okay. Entonces, sobre la presentación, dos cosas que quería empezar diciendo. La primera es que en conferencias como esta, sobre hombres y masculinidad, en general he escuchado algunas veces algunas ponencias que hacen las presentaciones que insisten de una manera o de otra de expor sus trabajos y sus instituciones para enseñar cómo se hace. Es the same. In the field. Yeah. You don't need to translate this.
Everybody said the slide.
When I have text, no have translate. Y yo creo que es muy complicado para yo hacerlo así porque creo que es necesario hacer una crítica sobre esta manera de presentaciones. Porque en general muchas veces estamos presentando como una manera masculina de hablar sobre las cosas y una manera machista masculina de hablar sobre las cosas, diciendo no solo lo que hice, pero lo que debe ser. Entonces no voy a intentar decir aquí lo que debe ser, sino lo que yo hice, nosotros hicimos, más como enseñar posibilidades y experiencias.
He's saying that he's very critical about the many international conferences in which only a theoretical part of the theme and aspects are seen, but he is going to present something which they have personally worked upon, they have personally taken care of.
Yo creo que es más feminista porque está basado más en la idea de la solidaridad y del cambio de qué competencia.
This idea is more a feminist idea, which is based more and more on solidarity with the women.
Sobre el proyecto que estamos haciendo, no es un proyecto que está concluido, entonces el proyecto ha sido producido por una demanda, un pedido que ha sido hecho por la Petrobras, que es una empresa brasileña de petróleo, que tiene el objetivo entonces el proyecto de dirigirse a los temas de violencia y promoción de salud y género, y equidad de género, la región de SWAP. Yo voy a hablar un poco sobre SWAP después. I will talk about SWAP after. Y estamos haciendo basado en la experiencia con 5 grandes temas que estamos manejando con estos hombres, que son cuidado y autocuidado, la salud, el uso y abuso del alcohol y otras drogas, la paternidad y el cuidado, la prevención de violencia y la diversidad sexual. Es lo mismo que es decente. Okay. About SWAP. Okay. SWAP es una región, una microregión en Brasil que creció en los últimos años, creció un montón por el trabajo de construcción de una petroquímica, de una refinería y también de un estalero, o sea, construcción de grandes barcos. Y con esto la economía, la inversión económica en esa región creció un montón, creció también la posibilidad de trabajo, pero como es una zona que tú puedes ver aquí, que hay playa, pero también hay una situación de pobreza muy fuerte, entonces con este contraste y este crecimiento económico, desarrollo económico, hemos visto que sería también había necesidad también de manejar con esos temas ahí.
I would like to yes, sir. Okay. In the slide you can see that, as he has said, that in economic investment there's a lot of investment from outside. We can see that there are beaches in the picture, the first picture and the second one. You can also see the poor condition of the people living in those places. So there is a lot of contrast in the conditions of the people and the economic development.
Y lo curioso en esta situación es que no ha sido solo una observación nuestra, sino también de la Petrobras. O sea, la preocupación de la empresa era que hubiera desarrollo económico, pero que también hubiera un cuidado con el desarrollo social.
It's very curious to understand that this is not only our observation of our NGO, it's also an observation of the Petrobras company, the petrochemical company which is there. It says that there should be an economic development, but we should also focus on social development of the place.
Esto no significa que no hay contradicción.
It does not mean that there's no contrast in the situations.
Some pictures of this region. Brazil, Pernambuco is the region. Suape is the two cities. Cabo de Santo Agostinho is one of the cities. And Pojuca is the other. Juntas, ellas hacen con 210,000 habitantes más o menos.
Together this is more or less 110,000 of population of the.
Y con la construcción de ese conjunto de empresas, estamos hablando entonces de la llegada de 50,000 hombres en esta región.
And we are talking about 50,000 men who came in that particular area to work.
O sea, 20% más que tenía en total de la región.
Which means 20% of more population which the area already had.
Y la gran mayoría, como estamos hablando de construcción civil, son hombres, jóvenes, negros y pobres.
And the majority of whom are youth, young, and also people black men.
Y eso es muy importante porque no son solo hombres, no son solo negros, no son solo pobres, no son solo jóvenes, sino una conexión entre las cuatro marcadores sociales.
It's not only about we are talking about youth, you are talking about black men, or you are talking about people who are coming from outside. These are very important benchmark of the society. Four kind of people which they represent.
Entonces aquí solo para enseñar más contextualizaciones sobre esta situación. Entonces la región es una de las primeras de Brasil donde empezó el crecimiento poblacional, y también es una región donde hay una histórica inequidad de género.
Also, this is the reason where we can see gender inequality for a long time. In the historical past, we had also seen gender inequality in this particular area.
Hay pocas investigaciones sobre esta región.
Very little research and studies conducted in that region.
Y sobre también actividades con esta población de hombres que están en trabajo de estas condiciones.
And less about the men who are working in that area in these conditions.
Que son hombres en general que no viven ahí después que concluye la obra. Salen a vivir en otros sitios buscando otros trabajos de la misma manera. O sea, son hombres que migran buscando trabajo, y cuando migran muchas veces construyen una otra familia en cada sitio donde está.
That we are not only talking about the people who work there and live there. They work from one place and shift to another when the project is finished and project get over. And also they go to other places and they make families and they make different family units.
Por eso es muy importante entender la situación específica de esta población, incluso porque la política pública en Brasil está basada en dos principios fundamentales. Uno, que es el concepto de familia, y el otro, la condición de territorialidad.
That's why it's very important to understand and do the research on these people, because this is a very special situation. In public policies and the legislation in Brazil, it's based on two important laws, which are the laws of the concept, a concept of the people who live there, and concept of the territoriality of the place.
Good translation. Okay, and we talk about the plan. Okay, entonces este es el plan de acción que hicimos en el proyecto. Es un amplio proyecto, entonces estoy hablando de una parte del proyecto. Entonces el proyecto todo está dirigido con 7 subproyectos. algunos de investigación, otros de formación y capacitación y sensibilización, y algunos también de comunicación. Entonces, manejando con jóvenes, con mujeres y con hombres.
This is a very big project, and we can see here a plan which is divided into seven small projects, and this is the plan that we are working on. This is about investigation, research, studies, and also sensibilization of the people, and also capacity building.
Y estamos hablando aquí entonces más específicamente del proyecto 3.
Here we are specifically talking about the third part that we can see in this slide.
Conversation with men. El modelo conceptual que tenemos, que basa el proyecto, está basado en 3 posibilidades de manejar y discutir las cosas desde nivel cultural, nivel institucional y nivel interactivo de las
The 3 important conceptual models that we have discussed about working on conversations with men. They are those.
Que se traduce en un modelo metodológico que está dirigido entonces en la condición de cultura, nivel cultural, buscar hacer actividades de sensibilizaciones, son lectures, sensibilización de diálogos sobre seguridad que tenemos y también actividades de campaña.
In the first part, we do campaigns in different small communities, and also we deliver lectures and we promote dialogues between the communities. In the first.
Same thing then.
Okay.
It's the same thing.
Sí, más o menos. Funciona. Yes. Okay. En el nivel institucional, o sea, trabajando, manejando, haciendo encuentros, no solamente con los grupos de hombres, sino también con los gerentes de las compañías, de las empresas. Y también trabajando con multiplicadores, o sea, personas que van a hacer el trabajo con los otros hombres, con peer education. Nivel interactivo, entonces, son workshops directamente con los hombres y otras actividades en diferentes espacios de las empresas. Entonces, con los 3 niveles. Aquí son los focos temáticos del proyecto. Entonces, los 4 principales temas que hemos trabajado en los grupos y también en los otros niveles. Hombre y salud, la diversidad sexual, paternidad y la violencia de género, basada en género. Entonces, creo, I think those.
Yeah, that's
okay. Aquí some examples of a campaign we did. This is about alcohol. Nosotros hicimos entonces un cambio de estética de las tradicionales campañas sobre drogas. O sea, no enseñar mensaje diciendo no haga, no puede, porque los hombres que escuchamos hablando antes, desde el punto de vista de la investigación, ellos decían que entraba por aquí y salía por aquí, o sea, no hacía diferencia escuchar ese tipo de cosas.
In the campaign, what we did was a very different kind of change. There was a aesthetic change that we did in the campaign against the drugs consumption. What was happening in the past was only to say that to stop drinking, stop consuming alcohol, stop doing such things, stop doing those things. What we did was a very different kind that.
Basada entonces, la propuesta es basada en la concepción de reducción de daños, que mirar más para los prejuicios que el uso del alcohol puede causar en la vida de un hombre y no decir que no. O sea, no funcionaría este tipo de información. Y la estética también hicimos como si fuera un cartel, como cualquier otro cartel que se podría poner en un bar. Incluso como una identificación más cercana para estos hombres.
What we did was a different kind of proposal. We started doing campaigns based on the public awareness and also making people aware of the damages and the harms that the consumption of alcohol and the drinking could cause. Also, we put different letter boards saying that what drugs and alcohol can cause as harm and damages.
Es más o menos como para empezar a dialogar. Esto no es el mensaje final, sino la primera mensaje para empezar a hablar con ellos.
This is what we see here is not exactly the campaign, but it was just paving the way of how do we start dialoguing with the people that we can see here. as one a letter.
Sobre paternidad, entonces la idea de la paternidad y del cuidado como experiencias que puede hacer parte de la vida de los hombres también.
Fatherhood could also happen, a beautiful thing with the men too.
Y si puede mirar, no hay mujeres en las fotos.
That we can see that there are no women in the photo.
Porque pensamos incluso que muchas veces estamos hablando de paternidad como si fuera al revés de la maternidad, y hay cosas específicas de cada uno que no tiene que ver la idea de contraste.
That many times when we talk about the paternity, we think that's a thing which is totally in contrast with the motherhood. It's not that. They are very different. There can be different things. They can also be in so many things similar.
Y cuando estamos hablando de derechos en el campo de la paternidad, no estamos hablando de no derecho en la cuestión de la maternidad.
When we are talking about the rights of men as far as in terms of fatherhood, we are not talking about not having rights for women as motherhood.
Son campos diferentes que muchas veces nuestra tradicional mirada de género no consigue percibir.
There are different fields that we generally, our gender sensitivity could not perceive as different and similar to.
Estamos hablando de cuidado.
We are talking about caregiving.
Y aquí, entonces, la tercera campaña que hicimos, que es sobre diversidad sexual.
In this campaign, we did about the sexual diversity,
que habla sobre derecho.
Which talks about the rights of the people.
In life rights, in work respect. Esta ha sido la más difícil de hacer.
This has been one of the difficult projects to do.
Por la resistencia de los empresarios más grandes.
Because of the resistance from the big entrepreneurs in those places.
Creemos por varias cosas que quizás una de las posibilidades sea porque las dos anteriores hablan de alguna manera de una forma de control, y esta habla sobre placer y derecho.
This could be the hurdle that was produced by the entrepreneurs could be because of two reasons. One was the control of drugs, and another was pleasure and placer
y derecho.
And rights, pleasure and rights.
Estoy hablando esto porque creo que está dirigida a una mirada nuestra sobre la demanda de la empresa, porque cuando la empresa nos invitó a hacer este trabajo, decía para nosotros que van a llegar 50,000 hombres con prácticas predatorias sobre aquella región. Tenían un prejuicio sobre los hombres.
I'm talking about this because the company invited us and told us there are 50,000 people coming with the different practices that they do at their home.
Y parecía que al final la empresa quería controlar estos hombres.
And it seemed that the company was actually trying to control those men coming over.
Y por eso hemos hecho incluso para nosotros esta pregunta: ¿qué queremos cuando estamos pensando en trabajar con los hombres?
That's why this is a very important question to ourselves, that what we want to do when we want to work with the men.
Queremos describir, controlar, vigilar y punir.
We want to describe, we want to control, we want to explain.
La centralidad entonces del concepto de responsabilidad, yo creo que no nos ayuda mucho.
The central theme in those research and areas would be the responsibility.
Tenemos quizá que hacer una revisión del texto de Cairo.
We'll have to review the text of Cairo.
Cuando habla demasiadamente y casi exclusivamente sobre responsabilidad.
When it talks especially and exclusively about the responsibility.
Okay. Para finalizar, solamente algunas imágenes.
And to conclude with, we can just look over some pictures.
Para exemplificar algumas das ações.
Just in order to make this presentation an idea clear to you.
Peer education, training. Este nombre de diario de conversación es un nombre que la institución de las empresas que existen. Este nombre ya es una tradición, pero es un momento cuando empieza el trabajo Y ahí
The name of the
día.
campaigns are based on the different companies and enterprises which already exist in there.
Workshops and public events. Okay, thank you very much. Thank you.
Questions, clarifications for Professor?
I just want to know the last feature on security. Can you talk more about it?
ये हटा दे, आपने उसको हटा दे, please remove that.
Security would,
Yeah, I understand. Entonces, a ver cómo voy a explicar esto. Todas las empresas tienen un momento por día que se llama diálogos diarios de seguridad.
Every enterprise and company have a particular time frame in which they hold this discussion, and they are called daily conversations about security.
É um momento tradicional quando começa o dia. Perdão, quando começa. Oh Deus, é complicado. A ver, perdão. Entonces, es un momento tradicional para empezar el día en las empresas.
This is a traditional way of set out the day for all the companies and enterprises.
Entonces, la primera lección que tuvimos con nuestro proyecto ha sido la necesidad de organizar nuestras actividades adaptándonos a las normas también, a forma de organización de las empresas.
So the first exercise that we did and that we started was to integrate ourselves with the time schedules of the companies, and we accordingly went there to facilitate.
Entonces es un momento más para fortalecer las actividades del workshops do que una actividad final. O sea, es más como una propaganda que hacemos para poder incluso fortalecer una cultura contra la homofobia, una cultura contra el sexismo.
This was a very important moment for ourselves, and also a very good campaign and a campaign of awareness where we could go there and talk about the machismo and also anti-feminism.
Sola no funciona, pero sin ella no conseguimos hacer las otras actividades.
We could not have worked without their collaboration. We had to work in collaboration with the enterprises and their sessions.
Okay. So how do, just a follow-up, how do the peer education training, these are they members, or is it just random?
If you can give a very brief answer, and then you can have follow-up conversations during tea. Because we'll have to move out of this hall, and then your next session will start in 15 minutes.
Dice que cómo funciona esta capacitación acerca de la educación. ¿Son los socios de la organización tuya o son los de la empresa?
Son los dos.
This is mixed of two. They are members of the organization, NGO he works for, and also the enterprise, the company which is there.
Before we all start moving out, let's just thank the panel for some very interesting conversations. Showing us how in different contexts economic models can actually shift norms, and how it's up to us how we make them.
Thank you very much.